Hello, welcome to the Jaggy Thistle. My name is Kenny Farkas and I'm your host for these discussions about Scottish politics and Scottish culture. And today we're going to talk about something that's been bugging me for a long time actually. And it goes to the heart of one of the great unexplored questions in Scottish politics, and particularly about the issue of Scottish independence. And we'll get to that. But first of all, I want to ask a question. In the nationalist movement, the independence movement, there's a kind of lazy assumption. And the lazy assumption is that the independence is inevitable. And people think that because they think there's a demographic logic to the fact that we will inevitably be an independent country. And the logic goes like this, that most elderly people support the Union, support the continuance of the United Kingdom. Most young people support independence. So as an older generation dies off and a new generation comes onto the electoral roll, inevitably Scotland becomes more pro-independence. So the theory basically is the crematorium will deliver independence, which is fine, and you can see how that's an appealing prospect, and how that would give people who believe in independence a warm glow and a kind of confidence that the future belongs to them. But there's a problem. In fact, there's a couple of problems with it. The first is that it's complacent. And if the crematorium is going to deliver independence, there's no need to go Chapman on doors. There's no need to persuade anybody. There's no need to keep your offer of independence fresh and relevant to the needs of the day and the changing circumstances all around us, nationally and internationally. There's no need to do any of that because it's going to happen anyway. So it forces a kind of an intellectual laziness and a complacency, which I think anyone who's in the independence movement can recognise perhaps in the current situation. But there's another problem as well. The maths don't add up. Okay, so let me explain. I mean, it's been almost 10 years, 11 years since the referendum in 2014. And in that time, sadly, we've lost maybe 500,000 Scots. Elderly Scots have died. And they were predominantly unionist. And in that same time, about 500,000, very rough figures, but 500,000 young people have come onto the electoral roll at 16, predominantly supporting independence. So that's a change of 1 million people in an electorate of about 4.3 million people. Now, given that kind of change, Scotland should be independent by now. Or at the very least, Scotland should have an overwhelming majority in favour of independence. That's the logic of the crematorium theory of Scottish independence. But it hasn't happened. Independence is still round about the 50% mark, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more. But there hasn't been that surge that the crematorium theory would suggest is going to happen. And why is this the case? So what's going on here? Have people been changing their mind as they get older? The academics who've looked at this would suggest not. They say that there is what statisticians call a cohort theory, that people who believe in independence in their 20s believe in independence in their 30s. People who believe in independence in their 40s still believe in independence in their 50s. So there's a kind of, the cohort effect suggests that people's feelings about independence or the Union are what we call sticky. They're hard to dislodge. So what's going on? What's happening here? And I think the answer to that is found in some very interesting polling that there was in the Sunday Times, one of my sister papers, at the weekend. There was an article there by one of my colleagues called David Leask, very good reporter, who obtained some hitherto unreleased data from recent opinion polling, some YouGov opinion, Ipsos opinion polling recently. And what it did was it asked people what was their country of birth. Very simple question. Before it asked all the other questions about what do you believe in X, Y, and Z, it asked them, where were you born? And the results of that were fascinating, and the results of that explained a lot about what's going on, and also posed some questions, some very serious questions for Scottish politics and Scottish politicians as we go into the Holyrood election campaign. Holyrood election is next May. So what did these figures tell us? I wrote them down just so I didn't really get them wrong. When it asked people, it divided people into groups then according to the country of their birth. People who were native-born Scots, people who live in Scotland and were born in Scotland, they were in favour of independence by a fair margin. Let me just find this. Actually, just from the top of my head, they said that I think there was 57% of those believed in independence, and 43% believed in carrying on the Union, believing in the UK. The people who were from England, so it's English people living in Scotland, Scottish citizens who were born in England, they were against independence. They were against independence by quite a large margin, by 35% to 65%. Okay, so 35% believed in independence, 65% believed in staying with the UK. And the other group they looked at was people who were immigrants from elsewhere in the world, who were Scottish citizens who were born elsewhere in the world. And they too were against independence by a margin of 60 to 40. 60% wanted to stay in the UK, 40% wanted independence. So what this is very rarely examined in the whole Scottish national question, in the whole Scottish conversation about our national future, is what is the difference between where people, based on where people were born. So what we have here is a situation where native-born Scots want independence, but people who aren't native-born Scots don't want independence. And this, again, was one of the situations. This was true back in 2014 when we had a referendum on Scottish independence. That in that referendum, there was a study done afterwards by academics, and they found that if it had just been native-born Scots who were asked the question in September 2014, Scotland would be independent by now. The reason that Scotland isn't independent was because people who were immigrants to Scotland, whether from England, from other bits of the United Kingdom, or from further afield, didn't want independence. And it was the immigrants, however defined, that swung it. And this is not an unusual situation. It shouldn't have been a surprise, okay? Because back in 1995, when there'd been a referendum on Quebec independence in North America, in Canada, exactly the same thing happened. Among native-born Quebecers, there was a majority for breaking away from Canada. But among immigrants, there wasn't. Among immigrants, there was opposition to independence. And the very senior Parti Québécois politician at the time, caused a great uproar afterwards by saying he blamed, quotes, money and the ethnic vote for the fact that Quebec independence had been lost. So, lots of lessons from Quebec were learned for the Scottish referendum in 2014. On both sides scoured that campaign in Quebec for clues, for slogans. That's where the no campaign slogan, no thanks, came from. The no campaign in Quebec, which was non merci. So things were lifted wholesale from that campaign. So the lesson about immigrants should have been clear to everyone. It wasn't. Now, what I've just described I know it's quite a tricky thing, quite a sensitive thing, and quite a controversial thing to say. But it's greatly to the credit of Scottish nationalism and Scottish nationalists that what I've just described is not part of the grievance culture within our constitutional debate. Okay? We don't have in Scotland, well, we do have, but it's kind of suppressed and subdued. But within the mainstream nationalist movement and the leadership of the nationalist movement, there is the civic belief that if you're a Scottish citizen, regardless of where you were born, you are entitled to just as much a say in the country's future as somebody who can trace their lineage back to Robert the Bruce. Okay, so that must not be underestimated. That is a real civic strength of our society here in Scotland and our nation. It isn't the case elsewhere in other nationalist movements abroad. So that's something we need to prize and we can all be proud of that in Scotland, not just within the nationalist community. But because of a kind of a reluctance to talk in those terms and to address those issues, to address the issue of where you were born, it means that some things are left unexamined and left unsaid. And in particular, some aspects of the SNP strategy are questionable. For example, if persuading English-born people in Scotland to back independence is a priority or should be a priority for the SNP, then why on earth is somebody like Stephen Flynn, who is the Westminster leader of the SNP, why is he carrying on with this kind of thing he's very keen on, which is trying to denigrate the entire English culture, and saying that England doesn't share our values, and trying to kind of other the English and try to present Scotland as a nation apart that is not really in tune anymore with British culture, which we read as English culture in Westminster. Why is he doing that if persuading English people in Scotland should be an SNP priority, should be a yes priority, looking forward to a new referendum at some point in the future? Because there's almost 600,000 people in Scotland who were born in England or elsewhere in the United Kingdom, most of them from England. That's a large chunk of the Scottish population. These are people who are Scottish citizens, and they all have friends and they all have relatives back south of the border. They're not going to take kindly to being told that these people have an alien culture or alien values, and that they're not, that Scotland is superior morally, and to these people. So there's a difficulty there. I understand the reluctance to deal and to kind of discuss this issue, but ultimately you have to be honest about our politics, all aspects of our politics, and you have to be able to address all these things openly. Otherwise, other people will. Okay, and I'm sure that I think we all know there are blood and soil nationalists in Scotland under rocks scattered around this nation, and at some point we may need to kind of deal with these people. But fear of those people shouldn't stop us from examining our politics in the round and looking at all the complexities that we find. So I've been writing about this in the Times today. I wrote about it in the Jaggy Thistle a while back. I'll put links to those pieces in the notes to this chat. But there's a couple of things that will leave a couple of questions that are raised by what I've been saying to you. The first is, if immigration is a drag on independence, then it follows that Scotland can have independence or it can have more immigration. It can't have both. Because every new person who comes to Scotland from England or from elsewhere is likely to have a negative view of independence. So the more immigrants Scotland has, the less likely Scotland has of voting for independence. And you might ask, well, why are these immigrants not keen on independence? Well, I think for a lot of English people, there's the obvious one that they perhaps have more ties to England, family, social, cultural, business ties to England. But there's also a question of, why do people move country? Why do people migrate from one country to another? And I think a lot of the time it's for economic reasons. Okay, so the people move. They're looking for they're working for Barclays Bank in Manchester, and they get promotion and come and work on that big shiny Barclays building on the banks of the Clyde in Glasgow. So people move for all kinds of reasons, but a lot of the time they move for love, but oftentimes they move for money. And if you're moving for economic reasons, you might well see independence as jeopardizing a prosperity and opportunity. You might see it as closing off some opportunities for you economically. Now, that may be fair, that may be unfair, but it's a perfectly rational conclusion to reach. And it may well be the conclusion that leads these immigrants, English or otherwise, to say, I don't want to support Scottish independence. The other question I want to leave you with is a bit of a dilemma, because the SNP is very hard on Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, for his stance on immigration. And it's one of the real features of the SNP, the SNP strategy at the moment is to criticise the Prime Minister and the Labour government for his stance on immigration. But the truth is this: the more success Keir Starmer has in driving down the numbers of immigrants to the United Kingdom, which have absolutely soared in the last few years, particularly under Boris Johnson, the more success he has in bringing those numbers down, the greater the chances of Scotland gaining independence. So that's just one of the kind of the curiosities that this debate throws up. I hope you've enjoyed this chat. As I say, I'm going to put a link in the notes to a column I wrote about this in the Times on Wednesday's edition of the Times. And I'll also put a note to a long essay, perhaps too long, that I wrote on this subject a couple of years ago in the Jaggy Thistle. Let me know what you think. This is going to be a conversation, a community we have here. Let me know what you think. Agree, disagree. If you've spotted some flaws in my argument, or if you've spotted some things I haven't addressed, let me know. Let's have that conversation. Thanks for listening.